As we are all aware, we are currently living through an exciting time with the boom in generative AI technologies. This has resulted in an AI revolution that is redefining what's possible in almost every industry, accelerating progress and transforming the way we live and work. We're seeing this especially with the wave of new startups with generative AI at its core. And all of these new startups are continuing to flourish in the marketplace. So you may be wondering, how did this AI revolution begin in the first place? And that, of course, is due to the launch of ChatGPT, which is one of the key catalysts for the Gen AI boom and attracting investment and sparking innovation in the field. When Microsoft acquired ChatGPT and incorporated their technologies into their ecosystem, the race continued with the development of Bard from Google. Again, this just scratches the surface of the many disruptors in the industry that has paved the way for the rise of prompt engineering, a methodology that has become critical to the success of large language models and other types of generative models. So to kind of put the pieces all together, I've mentioned a couple terms in the previous slide. Generative AI refers to a subset of AI techniques that involve using neural networks to generate new and original content. LLMs, or large language models, are a type of generative AI model that can generate human-like text in response to a given prompt or input. And then we have prompt engineering, which involves designing high-quality prompts or inputs that result in desirable outputs from LLMs and other generative models. In other words, prompt engineering is a key strategy for optimizing the performance of LLMs and leveraging the power of generative AI more broadly. With all that being said, my name is Kathleen. I'm a returning AI project management intern, and in today's presentation, I'm going to be providing an overview of our recent prompt engineering laboratory, a recent collaborative project aimed to empower and enable participants to explore the state-of-the-art prompt engineering techniques and to help them identify potential use cases and applications for their organization. So in today's presentation, I want to touch on three main topics. First, I'll be briefly covering what prompt engineering is, and then provide an overview about the prompt engineering lab itself. And in the end, I'll discuss some key insights and takeaways from the completion of our prompt engineering cohort 1. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So to provide another definition, at a high level, prompt engineering is a technique in NLP that allows us to perform various tasks without relying on large labeled data sets or significant fine-tuning. It involves using pre-trained language models and carefully constructed input text to condition the model for specific downstream tasks. So an example here on your left, you can see an example of a traditional sentiment classification problem with no prompting. And on the right, we can perform sentiment classification with prompting by providing partially masked input text. In this case, for a restaurant review, the food at this restaurant is masked. This was a disappointing dining mask, and having the model predict the masked words to the output sentiment with words like terrible and experience. So now I want to touch on a couple of example use cases that we discovered, and just an interesting note, we actually did this before ChatGPT, and we continue to add this when ChatGPT was launched. So interesting ones obviously are text generation. This leverages language models to generate new and coherent text based on training from a collection of existing texts. We're seeing how transformative it has been today, of course, with ChatGPT, but even before ChatGPT, we saw Borealis AI Turing, which is essentially a tool that converts text to SQL, and it also enables users to understand how the SQL code was generated. Another interesting one that I want to touch on, and that's very hot in the market today, is image generation, another popular use case enabling the generation of images from textual descriptions. So it's very powerful, especially in advertising and marketing. And today we're even seeing it being used to generate business presentations. So now to dive deeper into the details of the lab. So the prompt engineering lab itself is a knowledge transfer type of project. And the goal is to increase the knowledge and skill sets of our sponsor participants through experiential learning. The project format is a laboratory, which we are piloting for the first time this year. So how does a lab differ from other project formats? So in a lab, the aim is for exploration and experimentation. And when participants come in, they're not required to have a use case. So with that being said, what are the goals and milestones that participants did have to work through? So first, we wanted participants to experiment with different techniques in prompting large language models during the various hands-on sessions. Second, we wanted them to acquire skills and knowledge to adopt prompt engineering techniques into a defined use case by the end of the lab. And of course, during the end and during hands-on, during the final showcase day, we want participants to flesh out and have that defined use case ready and apply the methodologies that they learned during the lab. So here are just some topics that we covered during the lab. Big kudos to the AI engineering team who worked really hard on developing the notebooks and also the lectures. So we gave participants a wide variety of topics from an intro to language models, pre-training, fine-tuning zero-shot, few-shot, and prompting in general. We provided them with some examples on smaller models like on Hugging Face, and then we also gave them an opportunity to experiment with truly large language models like OPT 175 billion. We also explored newer and more interesting topics like fairness and bias in NLP and LLMs. So where are we today? So we are still currently deep in the execution phase. We have finished cohort 1, which occurred from April 4th to April 14th. The structure is that we had 4 days of lectures and 3 days of hands-on where participants got to fully experiment with the techniques and the language models in our vector cluster. We are having cohort 2 that's coming up in the next couple weeks from May 2nd to May 12th with, again, a very similar structure. And finally, we're going to be having a showcase day on June 14th where participants will get to showcase their learnings and discuss the fleshed out use case they've identified. So bringing that kind of all together, I wanted to provide some insights and a high-level snapshot. I was fortunate enough to work on this project from ideation before there was ChatGPT. So overall, we were able to secure 23 sponsor companies into the lab, so a very high level of interest. We had a total of 126 participants who registered. In cohort 1, we had 66 participants. Cohort 2, we are having 60 participants. And based on the first survey that we sent out to cohort 1, we received an NPS score of 8.1 from 26 respondents. Again, relatively good considering this is a relatively new topic and the first time that we are piloting the lab. So with all that being said, I wanted to share some key takeaways from a PMO perspective and also from me personally in being a part of the project from the beginning and up to this execution point. So first, there was a high level of participation and engagement from people who were more technically advanced during the lectures. They asked very specific questions about certain elements of prompt engineering. So it was really good to see that high level of engagement. Second, we also got really good feedback on the lectures and the new frontier talks that were conducted by Cohere and NVIDIA. Third, there was also some feedback about potentially adding more documentation and walkthroughs of the GitHub notebooks. I think for the hands-on days, right now it's very much free for all, so participants could kind of experiment with what they wanted, but I think it would be good to provide more walkthroughs or guidelines as to what notebooks they should pursue first. And then as people who have been part of the lab maybe have been aware, we had a lot of challenges with compute and the infrastructure. On some of the hands-on days, participants were not able to access the cluster resources. And because of that, unfortunately, it took a lot of the hands-on time away. So like this week, we had one makeup session, for example. But unfortunately, again, this is something that's out of our control. Another insight is that we had a huge variation in participants' technical capabilities. This created a lot of bottlenecks in terms of having participants be ready when it comes to the day 1 of the lab or having them be ready to experiment. There were also some participants whose deep learning or machine learning skills were not at par with the rest of the participants. So this is something that we can definitely further investigate for future labs. And finally, as I also mentioned before, we're looking to implement more structure during the hands-on days. So like giving participants, suggestions onto what notebooks to pursue first, and also being able to kind of share what it is that, they may want to pursue based on what some initial use case ideas they came with. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you so much for allowing me to present. I'm open to any questions or feedback.
Teams that you're working with, did it seem more exploratory, or was it like concrete use cases that these companies were looking to maybe like productionalize in the short term?
Yeah, great question, John. So we had a wide range. So one of the teams that I facilitated was KT, one of our new sponsors. So they came in to the Vector offices for 2 weeks to be part of the lab, and they were really interesting where each person in their team had a different use case. So there was one specifically in robotics, another one being able to use prompting for Korean language. So that for them, that was more defined. And on the contrary, I also had one team from Georgian where there was only one person who showed up to the lab. And in their case, it was more exploratory. They had a use case, which was to improve the performance of their chatbot, but we didn't really explore the use case. We kind of spent more time on allowing them to just kind of work through the notebooks on their own.
Thanks, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Hi, Kathleen. I have one question.
Hi.
I was wondering, like, if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience and what are your contribution in this lab. Like you explained very well, what are the steps and then, the cohort and everything. But I was just wondering, like, if you could touch on what you actually contributed and then what you learned a little bit. So I think that might be also helpful for the audience as well as the interns.
Yeah, definitely. So I came into this project and ideation, and again, as I briefly touched, it was really hard to basically find use cases, and that was what initially the PM team was in charge of, to identify, how businesses could use prompt engineering. And again, at that time, no ChatGPT. So there was only some examples that we could find. The marketplace, like Borealis, things like Stable Diffusion was out. So like the image generation one was there. So I was in charge of basically developing the use cases. And obviously, as as more generative AI technologies came out, it got a lot easier. So in addition to kind of developing the use cases, I, of course, also helped to establish the schedule of the lab. Initially, as many of you may have known, this lab was only supposed to be one cohort and 3 days. And because of the limited computing that we had and limited resources we had to split the lab into two. So we had to shift the schedule and expand it. So that was also, it wasn't challenging, but I think like considering the limited time that we had, that time crunch made it really hard to kind of make that change. And of course, during this execution phase, I also worked on the facilitation process. So working with teams to ensure that they had the resources that they needed. And in my case, because my team was from Korea, I had to come in person and be able to kind of facilitate the discussion between the AI engineering team and also help them get the resources that they need to have a successful lab. So yeah, those are just some of the things I did get to work on.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.